Get back to the dishes. That's all you're good for." The words landed in the middle of the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Not whispered, not muttered under breath. Spoken with the full, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been told he was wrong. Chef Dominic Voss stood at the center of the Maison Dorée prep kitchen, his white, double-breasted jacket immaculate, his hands resting at his sides with the easy certainty of someone who owned every room he entered. Around him, 6 line cooks, 2 sous chefs, and a pastry assistant stood at their stations. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The stainless steel surfaces caught the overhead light and held it, cold and indifferent, and the only sound was the low hiss of a pilot flame that nobody had thought to turn off. Marcus Webb stood at the industrial sink, a gray dish towel folded over his left forearm, his hands still and visible at his sides. He had said nothing. He had not reached for the sauté pan on the counter beside him. He had simply looked at Voss with the kind of stillness that takes years to build, the kind that does not come from indifference but from something much harder to acquire. "You heard me," Voss said. "Back to the sink. That's your station. That's your world. Don't forget it." The pastry assistant, a young woman named Celeste, looked down at her marble board. The 2 sous chefs found reasons to examine their knife rolls. Not one person in that kitchen said a word. What Dominic Voss did not know, what none of them could have guessed from looking at Marcus Webb in his gray dishwasher's apron, was who he had just humiliated. And when the truth came out, it did not just embarrass Voss. It ended him. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is placed for a reason. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you who Marcus Webb really was, and how a man can spend a lifetime building something extraordinary in plain sight, while the people around him see only what they expect to see. Now, here is what most people did not know about Marcus Webb. He had been washing dishes at Maison Dorée for 11 months. He arrived each morning at 6:15, before the prep cooks, before the sous chefs, before Voss himself rolled in at 8 with his leather portfolio and his imported espresso. Marcus came through the service entrance on Delancey Street, hung his jacket on the 3rd hook from the left, always the 3rd, and began his shift in silence. He scrubbed, he stacked, he kept the line moving. He was invisible in the way that people in certain positions are always invisible. Not because they lack presence, but because the people around them have already decided what they are. His mother, Edna Webb, had raised him in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Tremaine neighborhood of New Orleans, 12 blocks from the French Quarter, close enough to smell the restaurants on a still night. She had worked as a short-order cook for 19 years at a diner called Boucherie Bleue, a place that served red beans on Mondays and merleton stew on Thursdays and never had an empty table. Edna Webb was not a famous woman, but she understood food the way a carpenter understands wood grain, not as a subject to be studied, but as a living thing to be respected. She used to tell Marcus when he was young enough to stand on a step stool beside her at the stove, "Boy, you stay low and you build high. You don't announce yourself. You let the work speak." He had heard those words so many times that they had stopped being advice and become something closer to architecture, the invisible frame on which he had built everything that followed. What followed was this. Marcus Webb had graduated from the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park in 2009, finishing in the top 4% of his class. He had staged at 3 Michelin-starred restaurants, one in Lyon, one in Paris's 8th arrondissement, and one in Copenhagen. He had worked a full season under a chef in Burgundy known for a bouillabaisse so precise that food writers flew in from Tokyo to eat it. He had returned to the United States in 2014 and spent 6 years as a sous chef at a Charleston restaurant that held 2 stars of its own. He had left that position quietly to care for his mother during an illness. And when Edna Webb recovered, slowly, over 14 months, Marcus had found himself in New York, needing work, needing income, needing something that would let him keep the hours he needed to keep. The dishwasher position at Maison Dorée paid $17 an hour and asked no questions. He took it. He had not told anyone what he knew. He had not corrected anyone's assumptions. He had not placed his resume on the sous chef's desk or dropped his CIA diploma into conversation. He moved in silence. He watched the kitchen the way a man watches a river, patiently, reading the current, understanding every eddy and snag, and he said almost nothing at all. The only person who had begun to suspect something was a line cook named Darius Cole, a 26-year-old from Baltimore who had noticed, over several months, that Marcus's knife work when he trimmed vegetable scraps was not the knife work of a man who had learned it incidentally. Darius had said nothing about it yet, but he had noticed. And noticing, it turned out, would matter. Now, here is what most people did not know about Dominic Voss. He had built Maison Dorée over 14 years into one of the most recognized French restaurants in Manhattan. A Michelin star, a 4-month reservation wait, a prix-fixe menu that started at $340 a head. His photograph appeared on the dining room wall in a silver frame, beside his name in embossed gold lettering. He had appeared on 2 television programs, consulted for a hotel group in Dubai, and written a cookbook displayed prominently in the restaurant's entrance. He was, by any conventional measure, successful. He was also a man who had organized his world into a very specific hierarchy and believed in that hierarchy with the unexamined certainty of someone who had never had reason to question it. In Dominic Voss's kitchen, there were people who cooked and people who cleaned, and those 2 categories were, in his mind, as fixed and natural as the separation between the dining room and the service corridor. He did not think of himself as prejudiced. He thought of himself as a realist, someone who understood how things worked. What he understood in practice was that certain people belonged in certain places, and that the arrangement of his kitchen reflected a truth about the world rather than a choice he had made about it. Marcus Webb, in Voss's estimation, was a dishwasher. The fact that Marcus occasionally handled prep work when the kitchen ran short-handed was a concession to necessity, not a reclassification. Voss had made that clear more than once, in ways that were never quite direct enough to be actionable, but always precise enough to be understood. The dramatic irony of the situation was profound. Dominic Voss had spent 14 years building a reputation for French cuisine, had studied at Le Cordon Bleu in Paris, and considered himself one of the foremost authorities on classical French technique in New York. He had built his entire identity on that claim. He defended it in interviews. He enforced it in his kitchen with the rigor of a man who understood that his authority rested on being the most knowledgeable person in the room. He was not, in fact, the most knowledgeable person in the room. He had no idea. The morning the bet was made and began with a delivery dispute. A shipment of duck confit from the supplier had arrived with the wrong cut, and Voss was already in a poor temper by 9 o'clock. The kitchen was running behind on prep, and a junior line cook had burned a reduction that Voss had spent 20 minutes constructing the day before. The air smelled of scorched fond and tension, the particular combination that meant someone was going to absorb the morning's frustration before it was over. Marcus was at the sink, working through a rack of hotel pans from the previous night's service, when Voss came through the swinging door and stopped in the center of the kitchen. He looked around the room with the slow, assessing gaze of a man taking inventory of his dissatisfactions. His eyes landed on Marcus. "Webb," he said. Not a question, not a greeting. Marcus set down the pan he was holding and turned. "Chef." Voss looked at him with an expression not quite contempt, but close enough to its border that the distinction didn't matter much. "I've been hearing things," he said. "Someone told me you think you know something about cooking." The kitchen went quiet in the way that kitchens go quiet when something is about to happen that everyone will later claim they didn't see coming. "I know a few things," Marcus said. Voss smiled. It was not a warm smile. "A few things." He repeated it the way a man repeats something he finds faintly ridiculous. "You know what I think? I think a man who washes dishes knows how to wash dishes." He looked around at the kitchen staff, a slow, deliberate survey that invited them to share the joke. Two line cooks looked away. One sous chef made a small adjustment to his apron that required his full attention. Darius Cole, at his station near the pass, kept his eyes on his cutting board and said nothing, though his jaw had tightened by a degree that Marcus, from across the room, could not see but would later be told about. "Tell you what," Voss said, his voice taking on the quality of a man about to perform something for an audience. "I'll make you a bet. $5,000, my money against your—" He paused and let the pause do its work. "Whatever you've got. You cook me a classical French dish. Something real. Something that takes actual training. And if it's any good, I'll pay you $5,000 out of my own pocket." He spread his hands in theatrical generosity. "But if it isn't, and it won't be, you go back to the sink and never touch another pan in my kitchen again. Fair?" The room held its breath. Marcus Webb looked at Dominic Voss for a long moment. Not with anger, not with the heat of a man who has been insulted and wants the room to know it. With something quieter than that. Something that had been building for 11 months of 6:15 mornings and gray dish towels and the smell of other men's cooking rising from pans he was not supposed to touch. "Fair," he said. 6 words total. 5 of them were the setup. 1 of them was the answer. Voss nodded, satisfied. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "before service. You've got 90 minutes and full access to the larder. Let's see what a dishwasher can do with French cuisine." He walked back through the swinging door. The door swung twice behind him and then was still. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Darius Cole set down his knife, looked across the room at Marcus and said very quietly, "You sure about this?" Marcus picked up the hotel pan he had set down, turned back to the sink, and said nothing. But his hands, Darius would later remember, were perfectly steady. That night, after the kitchen closed and the last of the staff had gone, Darius found Marcus in the break room, sitting at the small table with a legal pad and a pen. He was not writing a recipe. He was writing a list of preparations. Timing sequences, temperature checkpoints, reduction ratios, in the compact, precise shorthand of someone who had done this not once, but hundreds of times. Darius sat down across from him without being invited and looked at the legal pad without speaking. "Where did you train?" Darius asked. Marcus looked up, studied the younger man for a moment. The sincerity of the question, the absence of performance in it, and then he told him. Not everything. Enough. Darius was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "I'm coming in early tomorrow. I'll have your mise en place ready." Marcus looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know," Darius said. "I'm doing it anyway." It was a small thing, a young cook offering to set up a prep station before dawn for a man who washed dishes. It was also an act of courage, because Darius Cole knew what Dominic Voss was like, and he knew what it meant to be seen helping the wrong person in the wrong chef's kitchen. He did it anyway. That was the kind of morning it was going to be. Darius Cole arrived at 4:50 in the morning. The service entrance on Delancey Street was still dark when he pushed through it, his breath visible in the November air, his knife roll tucked under one arm and a paper bag from the all-night bodega on Canal Street in his other hand. He had not slept much. He had lain in his apartment in Bushwick staring at the ceiling, thinking about what he had agreed to do and what it might cost him. And then he had gotten up at 4 and come anyway. That was the kind of man Darius Cole was. Not fearless, but willing. There is a difference between those two things, and it matters more than most people understand. He turned on the lowboy lights above the prep station nearest the larder and began pulling ingredients without a list. He had memorized what Marcus had written on the legal pad, not because Marcus had asked him to, but because he had read it twice and understood, in the way that a young cook with good instincts understands things, that what he was looking at was not a rough plan. It was architecture. It was the kind of preparation that does not come from ambition or bravado. It comes from years. By the time Marcus arrived at 6:15, through the service entrance, a third hook from the left, always the third, the mise en place was laid out in a line of small white ramekins with the precision of a surgical tray. Duck stock already reduced, shallots minced fine, thyme stripped from the stem, butter cubed and cold. Darius stood at the far end of the station with his arms crossed and his face arranged in careful neutrality, as if trying not to reveal how much he had already invested in the next 90 minutes. Marcus looked at the station. He looked at Darius. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." 2 words. Darius nodded once and picked up his knife and went back to his own station, because the kitchen would fill up in 2 hours, and he needed to be at his cutting board before Voss arrived, and because some things are better left in the space between two people rather than spoken into the open air of a room where anyone might hear. Voss arrived at 8:03, leather portfolio under one arm, imported espresso in the other, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has arranged something entertaining for himself. He came through the dining room door and stopped at the pass and looked at Marcus's station with an expression already composing itself into the smile he planned to wear when this was over. The kitchen staff had gathered in the way that people gather when something is happening that they cannot quite look away from and cannot quite bring themselves to watch directly. The 2 sous chefs stood near the walk-in. Celeste had found a reason to be at the counter nearest the prep station. 3 line cooks were at their own stations but had arranged themselves with clear sight lines to the center of the room. Nobody acknowledged that they were watching. Everyone was watching. Voss set his espresso on the pass and looked at his watch. 90 minutes. Clock starts now. Marcus Webb tied his apron, picked up his knife, and began. What happened in the next 87 minutes was not a performance. A performance is calculated for an audience, shaped by the awareness of being seen. What Marcus Webb did at that station was the opposite of a performance. It was the resumption of something that had been interrupted, a conversation with a craft he had been having, in one form or another, since he was 9 years old, standing on a step stool in the trémé, watching his mother's hands move over a cast-iron skillet with the unhurried certainty of someone who had nothing to prove. He made a duck confit with a gastrique, classical, unambiguous, the kind of dish that cannot be faked because every step has a correct answer, and the ingredients know when you are wrong. He broke down the duck with 7 cuts, clean and without hesitation. He rendered the fat at a temperature that Darius, watching from his peripheral vision, clocked at exactly the right number without a thermometer. He built the gas streak from the reduction Darius had prepared, adding the vinegar at the precise moment the sugar reached the color of dark amber, not caramel, not mahogany, amber. And the sound it made when it hit the pan was a sound that Celeste would later describe to her roommate as the sound of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Voss watched from the pass. His expression went through several changes in those 87 minutes, though he would not have admitted to any of them. The first was a slight narrowing of the eyes at the knife work. The second was a stillness that replaced the earlier satisfaction. The third was something more complicated, the particular discomfort of a man beginning to understand that the situation is not what he believed it to be, and who has not yet decided what to do with that understanding. He said nothing. He watched. At the 87th minute, Marcus plated the dish. He did not rush. He did not over-garnish. He placed the confit on a shallow white bowl with the gas streak drawn in a clean arc to the left, a small arrangement of braised endive to the right, and a single sprig of thyme laid across the top at an angle that was either precise or effortless. And in the hands of someone who truly knows what they are doing, those two things are the same. He slid the plate across the pass. "Time," he said. One word. Voss looked at the plate for a long moment. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Not the silence of a room waiting for something to happen. The silence of a room in which something has already happened and no one has yet said so out loud. Voss picked up a fork. He cut into the duck. He brought a piece to his mouth and chewed slowly, and his face did something that his face did not often do in that kitchen. It went still. Not the stillness of displeasure, not the stillness of a man searching for a polite criticism. The stillness of a man who has tasted something that has answered a question he did not know he was asking. He set the fork down. He did not say the dish was good. He did not say it was excellent. He did not reach for any of the words he had prepared for the version of this moment he had expected. He stood at the pass for 4 full seconds, and in a kitchen, 4 seconds of a chef's silence is a long time. And then he said, very quietly, "Where did you train?" It was the first honest question Dominic Voss had asked Marcus Webb in 11 months. Marcus looked at him across the pass. His hands were at his sides. His shoulders were relaxed. His breathing was even and unhurried, the breathing of a man who has been waiting a long time for a question and is in no rush to answer it now that it has finally arrived. "CIA," Marcus said. "Hyde Park, class of 2009. The kitchen did not erupt. There was no gasp, no dramatic shift in the air. What happened was quieter and more devastating than that. It was the sound of several people in a room simultaneously revising everything they thought they knew about the last 11 months. Celeste set down her pastry brush. One of the sous chefs turned from the walk-in and looked at Marcus with an expression equal parts recognition and something close to shame. Darius Cole kept his eyes on his cutting board, but the set of his shoulders changed. A small release, like a breath held too long, finally let go. Voss said nothing for another moment. Then, "Lyon, Paris, and Copenhagen," Marcus said, "and 6 years in Charleston, 2 stars." The silence that followed those words was a different kind of silence than the one that had preceded them. It was the silence of a hierarchy rearranging itself. The silence of a room understanding that the man at the industrial sink had not been beneath the man at the pass, had never been beneath him, had been, in every measurable way that the craft itself recognized, his equal or his better, and had known it, and had said nothing, and had come in through the service entrance at 6:15 every morning for 11 months, and hung his jacket on the third hook from the left, and washed the pans that other people cooked in. Voss picked up the fork again. He took another bite. He set it down. "The gastrique," he said, "the ratio." 3-to-1, Marcus said. "Vinegar to sugar. You reduce it longer than the standard. Gives it depth without the acid edge." Voss nodded slowly. The nod of a man receiving information he recognizes as correct, from a source he had categorically refused to recognize as credible. It was not a comfortable nod, but it was an honest one. He reached into the inside pocket of his chef's coat and produced his wallet. He set 5 $1,000 bills on the pass without ceremony, without flourish, without the theatrical generosity he had performed the day before. He set them down the way a man sets down something he owes. "The bet," he said. Marcus looked at the money the way his mother had taught him to look at things offered late, with recognition and without gratitude for the lateness. Then he picked it up. And that, the room believed, was the end of it. It was not the end of it, because what none of them knew, what Dominic Voss did not know, what Darius Cole did not know, what the 2 sous chefs and Celeste and the 3 line cooks with their careful sightlines did not know, was that someone else had been in the restaurant that morning. Someone who had arrived early for a private breakfast meeting with the building's owner, a real estate developer named Arthur Finch, who held the lease on the Maison Doré space and 3 other restaurant properties in Lower Manhattan. Someone who had come through the dining room at 7:45 and had stood at the small window set into the wall beside the service bar, the one Voss had installed for the aesthetic of it, so that diners could watch the kitchen during service, and had watched for nearly 40 minutes without announcing himself. His name was Gordon Ramsay. He was in New York for 4 days. He had 2 restaurants in the city and was in discussions about a third. He had known Arthur Finch for 6 years. He had arrived for a 7:30 breakfast that Finch had pushed to 8, and in the interval he had stood at that small window with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand and watched a man in a gray dishwasher's apron break down a duck with 7 cuts and build a gastrique from memory and plate a classical French dish, with the quiet authority of someone who had spent years earning the right to be that precise. He had watched the whole thing. He had watched Voss's face change. He had watched the 5 bills go down on the pass. He had watched Marcus pick them up. And then he had walked through the dining room door into the kitchen. The room went very still in a different way than it had been still before. This was the stillness of people who recognized a face and were not sure, for a moment, whether they were recognizing it correctly. Ramsay walked to the pass. He looked at the plate, still sitting where Marcus had set it, the gastrique arc still clean, the endive still arranged, the thyme sprig at its angle. He picked up the fork that Voss had set down and cut a piece of the duck and tasted it. The kitchen waited. Ramsay set the fork down. He looked up. His eyes found Marcus Webb, standing at the far side of the pass in his gray apron, hands at his sides, expression giving away nothing. "That gastrique," Ramsay said. "The depth on it. I've had versions of this dish in Lyon, in Paris, in Copenhagen." He paused. "That's better than most of them." He looked at the plate again, then back at Marcus. "I want the recipe," he said. 7 words. Delivered not as a compliment, not as a courtesy, but as the statement of a man who recognizes something worth having and says so plainly. Marcus Webb looked at Gordon Ramsay across the pass of Dominic Voss's kitchen. He looked at him with the same stillness he had brought to every morning for 11 months. The stillness that does not come from indifference, but from something much harder to acquire. Then he said, "I'll write it down." And Dominic Voss, standing 3 feet away with his wallet still in his hand, understood in that moment, with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful and too complete to be denied, exactly who it was that he had told to get back to the dishes. The reckoning did not come loudly. That is the thing about consequences that are truly earned. They do not arrive with sirens or spectacle. They arrive the way a tide arrives, steadily, without announcement, and by the time you notice the water at your feet, the shore is already behind you. Ramsay did not leave the kitchen immediately. He stood at the pass a moment longer, his eyes moving from the plate to Marcus to Voss and back to the plate, with the unhurried attention of a man assembling information he will use later, deliberately, in a setting of his own choosing. Then he thanked Arthur Finch, who had appeared at the dining room door with the muted expression of a man who has witnessed something he was not expecting and is not yet sure how to categorize. Ramsay said he would be in touch. He said it directly to Finch, but in a way that included the room. He left through the dining room. The door closed behind him without drama. What happened next took 4 days. 4 days in which Maison Dorée ran its service as it always had. The white tablecloths, the prix-fixe, the 4-month reservation wait, and in which Dominic Voss moved through his kitchen with the particular stiffness of a man who has been handed a truth he has not yet found a way to set down. He did not speak to Marcus about what had happened. He corrected a sauce, approved a new dessert, signed a supplier invoice. He performed the ordinary operations of his authority with the mechanical precision of someone performing them from memory rather than conviction. Marcus Webb came in at 6:15 each morning. 3rd hook from the left. He washed the pans. He kept the line moving. He said almost nothing. Darius Cole watched all of it from his station near the pass and said nothing either, because he understood that the situation had not yet finished becoming what it was going to become. On the 4th day, Arthur Finch called Dominic Voss into the dining room before service. Finch was a tall man with the quiet authority of someone who has spent 30 years making decisions that other people feel but rarely see. He sat at the corner table, the one reserved for ownership, and set a folder on the white tablecloth and folded his hands over it and looked at Voss with an expression that was not unkind but was entirely without softness. He said that Gordon Ramsay had called him the previous evening. He said that Ramsay had expressed significant interest in Marcus Webb, his background, his training, his experience, and had asked whether there was any structural reason Marcus could not be brought on in a different capacity. He said that, in the course of that conversation, Ramsay had described what he had witnessed through the kitchen window and at the pass, and that the description had raised questions about the management of his property. Voss began to say something. Finch raised one hand, just slightly, and Voss stopped. Finch said he had also spoken, separately, with 3 members of the kitchen staff. He did not say which 3. He said the accounts were consistent with each other and described a pattern of conduct toward Marcus Webb that went beyond the incident of the bet. A pattern Finch found inconsistent with the standards he expected in a restaurant that bore his building's address and his lease agreement. He opened the folder. He set a single page on the table and turned it to face Voss. A termination notice. Voss looked at it. The kitchen, on the other side of the swinging door, was beginning its morning prep. He could hear the low clatter of sheet pans, the hiss of a burner being lit, the muffled exchange of two cooks at the larder. Sounds he had organized for 14 years into the rhythm of a room he believed was his. He said, "You can't be serious." Finch said, "I am entirely serious." A pause that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Voss signed the page. He did it with the same pen he used to sign supplier invoices, and his hand was steady, and he did not look up when he was done. He left through the front entrance, not the service corridor. He did not go back through the swinging door. He walked out through the dining room past his own photograph in its silver frame and its embossed gold lettering, and the door of Maison Dorée closed behind him. And that was the last time Dominic Voss stood inside that restaurant as its head chef. The Michelin star remained. The restaurant remained. The 4-month reservation wait remained. What changed was who was standing at the pass. Arthur Finch offered Marcus Webb the position of executive chef 3 days later. He made the offer at the same corner table, with the same quiet authority, and set a contract on the white tablecloth and folded his hands and waited. Marcus read the contract from the first page to the last without rushing, the way his mother had taught him to read anything that carried weight. He asked 2 questions about the supplier relationships. He asked 1 question about the reservation policy. He said he would need a day to consider it. He took the day. He called his mother that evening from his apartment in Bed-Stuy. Edna Webb was in New Orleans, in the same 2-bedroom apartment in the Trem, 12 blocks from the French Quarter. She was 71 years old. Her health restored slowly over 14 months, and she kept a small garden on the fire escape now. Herbs, mostly, the kind she had always used in her cooking. She picked up on the 3rd ring, and Marcus told her what had happened from the beginning, leaving nothing out. She listened without interrupting. That was her way, to hear the whole thing before she said a word, because she believed that a person who interrupts a story has already decided what it means before it's finished. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You stayed low." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said, "and you built high." "Yes, ma'am." Another pause. Then Edna Webb said, "Take the job, baby. You already earned it 11 months ago. They're just catching up." He took the job. Darius Cole was promoted to sous chef on Marcus's first official day as executive chef. Marcus made the announcement before morning prep, standing at the pass in a white double-breasted jacket, his own, not borrowed, and he said Darius's name and the title and nothing else, because some things do not require elaboration. Darius stood at his station with his arms at his sides and his face arranged in the careful neutrality he had worn the morning of the bet, and then the neutrality broke, just briefly, into something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to its border that the distinction didn't matter much. Celeste, the pastry assistant, started a new dessert program that winter. Under Voss, permission had been a complicated currency. Under Marcus, she discovered it was simply a conversation. Dominic Voss did not open another restaurant. He consulted briefly for a hotel group in New Jersey, and the arrangement ended after 2 months by mutual agreement. And after that, his name stopped appearing in the places where it had appeared before. The television programs did not call again. The cookbook remained in the entrance of Maison Dorée for another 3 weeks, until Marcus quietly replaced it with a framed print of the French Quarter at dusk. The kind of image that reminds people where food actually comes from, Not from silver frames and embossed lettering, but from kitchens where someone's mother stood at a cast-iron skillet and taught a child to pay attention. Maison Dorée earned a second Michelin star 8 months after Marcus Webb took the pass. The review mentioned specifically the duck confit with gastrique. It described the gastrique as having a depth unusual in classical preparation, a controlled complexity that suggested not just technique, but understanding. The reviewer did not know the story behind the dish. But the dish carried the story in it anyway, the way all honest cooking carries the life of the person who made it. Now, I want to say something directly before this story closes. What happened to Marcus Webb in that kitchen on Delancey Street happens every day. Not always in a restaurant. Not always with a bet. Not always with Gordon Ramsay standing at a window with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. But the structure of it, the assumption, the dismissal, the invisible worth, the composed endurance, that structure is not rare. It is ordinary. It is the daily experience of people who have built extraordinary things in silence because the world around them decided, before they spoke a word, what category they belonged in. Marcus Webb never raised his voice. He never reached for the sauté pan on the counter beside him. He never named what was being done to him in that kitchen because he understood something that Dominic Voss, with all his Michelin stars and his leather portfolio and his embossed gold lettering, had never learned. That dignity is not something you demand. It is something you demonstrate. And the demonstration, over time, becomes its own kind of evidence. His mother had told him to stay low and build high. She had told him that in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Treme, in a kitchen that smelled of red beans and cast iron, and the particular warmth of a woman who understood food as a living thing. She had not told him it would be easy. She had not told him it would be fast. She had told him it would be true. And it was. The question I want to leave with you is this. Think of someone you know, or think of yourself, who carries something extraordinary that the room around them has never thought to ask about. A skill built in silence. A knowledge earned through years that nobody witnessed. A worth that exists whether or not anyone in the room has the eyes to see it. How many Marcus Webbs are standing at industrial sinks right now, in kitchens and offices and warehouses and classrooms, waiting not for rescue but simply for the question that Dominic Voss waited 11 months too long to ask? Drop a comment. Tell me about a talent you carry that the world hasn't seen yet, or someone you know who deserved the room's attention long before they got it. I want to hear those stories because they matter, and if this one moved you, if you believe that the people the world overlooks deserve to have their stories told, share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe. Every week, we find the people who stayed low and built high, and we make sure the room finally knows their name.